Fans have debated for years whether or not Lucasfilm could tackle the horror genre with a true Star Wars horror movie, but they kinda already have through the lens of body horror, and believe it or not, there's a lot of body horror in Star Wars. For those who aren't familiar with the horror subgenre, body horror or biological horror intentionally showcases grotesque or psychologically disturbing violations of the human body, typically pushing the physical form of its subjects to their natural limits and beyond. These body violations may manifest through mutations, mutilation, zombification, excessive violence, disease, decay, or just unnatural movements of the body. So now that I've terrified you by explaining what body horror is, let's take a look at the many different examples of body horror across Star Wars media. I think the biggest example of body horror in Star Wars lies within cybernetics. Cybernetics in Star Wars can range from prosthetics and enhancements to fully transformed human cyborgs and everything in between. Losing a limb in Star Wars is almost never fatal, and characters usually receive a lifelike replacement shortly after. So let's dive into the more extreme cases and transformations that really cross the line into body horror. The first and most easily recognizable example of body horror in Star Wars is Anakin Skywalker's transformation into Darth Vader. Throughout A New Hope, Darth Vader's suit is easily perceived as just that, a scary suit, but it's not until The Empire Strikes Back that we get a peek at the man behind the mask, eventually realizing that Vader requires the suit to survive by the conclusion of the original trilogy. In Revenge of the Sith, we're finally shown the events that led up to Vader's cyborg transformation, with the loss of his left arm and legs, watching what's left of his body catch on fire and char as he screams in agony. But if that wasn't enough body horror for you, the final sequence of Anakin's transformation at the end of the film takes Star Wars body horror to a whole new level. Watching the medical droids tend to his injuries, peeling away the melted clothing from his flesh, and confining him into his new cybernetic prison. Before we continue, please leave a like and consider subscribing for more Star Wars content. 11 years later, Rogue One teased us with another glimpse of Vader outside the suit, this time suspended inside a Bacta tank within his castle on Mustafar. But the Obi-Wan Kenobi series really doubled down on Vader body horror, showing the Sith Lord literally being pieced back together. Something about seeing the cybernetic parts implanted into his body and the visual of his mechanical arms and legs piercing into what's left of his appendages was really unnerving to watch and made my skin crawl. A large component of what makes body horror so scary is how it taps into the fears of our body's fragility and the loss of control over our physical selves. And this is exactly the case with Darth Vader. Palpatine stripped away Vader's bodily autonomy and imprisoned him inside a mechanical suit he can't survive without. This was the perfect way to keep Vader isolated, obedient, reliant, and at the mercy of his master. Now, Darth Vader isn't our only example of extreme injury turned body horror though, as a similar transformation occurred to another iconic Star Wars villain, General Grievous. However, unlike Vader, Grievous's transformation was all a part of the plan. Following a horrific shuttle crash secretly orchestrated by Count Dooku, Grievous regained consciousness in a Bacta tank gutted and deformed. Dooku then manipulated Grievous into believing the attack was orchestrated by the Jedi, coaxing the Kaleesh warrior to accept an offer of a life-saving surgery, transforming him into a fully cybernetic being, with only his brains, eyes, and some vital organs remaining. Then in 2008, we finally got a glimpse into Grievous's past through the Clone Wars Season 1 episode Lair of Grievous, with a statue of Grievous in his organic form, along with a tease of what lies beneath the mask as he undergoes maintenance. Watching Grievous crawl around like an insect in this episode always made me so uncomfortable, and the sequence of the droid doctor peeling off Grievous's face mask as he groans in discomfort makes my stomach turn. I honestly forget that Grievous was ever an organic being to begin with and see him as more of a droid than a cyborg, a sentiment Grievous is said to have despised. Seeing his sack of organs exposed in his mostly mechanical form always made me so queasy, and the scene right before his death in Revenge of the Sith is pure nightmare fuel. But in both Grievous and Vader's case, their cybernetic upgrades weren't really upgrades at all, but more of a mechanical prison, and that's what makes both of their appearances and existence truly horrifying. But the one thing I consider the most horrifying, disturbing, and egregious example of body horror in Star Wars is the Decraniated. The Decraniated were an order of servants produced by Dr. Evazan, you know, this guy.
I don't like you either.
By abducting victims and removing all, if not the majority of their heads, replacing it with cybernetics to strip them of their identities, making them as subservient as droids, and selling them as servants. Of course, all of this was done against their will as well, and I'll never forget how uneasy I felt the first time I saw one appear on screen in Solo: A Star Wars Story, and ever since, I try to avoid looking at them altogether because the longer I look, the more unsettling their appearance becomes, to the point where I start feeling nauseous. Other less prominent cases of cybernetic body horror in Star Wars include Fennec Shand in the mods and even Lobot, as well as the discovery and rescue of Echo in the Clone Wars Season 7. Even Star Wars Legends stories dove into the body horror genre with the introduction of Phase Zero Dark Troopers, which saw the Empire turn veteran clones into cyborg soldiers against their will, Starkiller's Sith Stalker transformation shown in the dark side ending of the Force Unleashed video game, and zombie stormtroopers from the novel Death Troopers. Speaking of the clones, cloning is another great example of body horror. On the surface, cloning in Star Wars is not inherently scary, but what makes it cross into body horror territory is cloning's ability to push the physical form of its subjects to their natural limits and beyond, which we see through the Kaminoans, Dr. Hemlock in the Bad Batch, and even Palpatine himself. Cloning has been a staple of Star Wars storytelling since the first mention of the Clone Wars in 1977.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
And became even more popularized in the 1990s through the Thrawn trilogy and Dark Empire comics. More recently, The Bad Batch Season 3 gave us our most in-depth look at the Imperial Advanced Science Division and their facility on Mount Tantus, which was basically a breeding ground for body horror. Mount Tantus was the home to many highly classified projects such as the Imperial Cloning Program, which included clone troopers and the Zillo Beast among other things, as well as Project Necromancer. I can only imagine the machinations they were able to produce at Mount Tantus, and that's probably why a lot of it was left to the imagination in the Bad Batch Season 3. Other recent examples of cloning body horror in Star Wars include the Clone Army with its good and bad mutations, the abandoned Kaminoan clones on Borovio, Moff Gideon's clones in The Mandalorian, and the Snoke clones on Exegol. Even Palpatine existing in The Rise of Skywalker is body horror, seeing him inhabit a decaying clone body, kept alive via wires and tubes, and mobilized by a mechanical spine. It's a true violation of the human body, pushed way beyond its limits. The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural, and the Sith's quest for immortality ultimately resulted in a lot of body horror. Now, with all this talk about body horror in Star Wars, it's actually not something we spend a lot of time exploring, as it usually only appears in quick, shocking sequences meant to startle viewers without spending too much time on the subject. However, there's one great example that gets a lot more screen time to make you a lot more uncomfortable, and that's the cyborg scavenger from The Mandalorian Season 3. The minds of Mandalore sees Din caught in a trap and sedated in a jump scare sequence, revealing a spider tank. Now at first, the spider tank seems fully mechanical, that is until we get the reveal of a singular, giant, organic eye, showing us that this being is more than just a tank. Now, if this wasn't enough to get the hairs on the back of your neck to stand up, the next reveal definitely will. After taking Din back to its lair, the being exits the tank, revealing a six-armed cyborg creature. Peering around with its singular eye, the creature crawls over to Din's body, discards his weapons, and begins to drain his blood. But it gets even worse as the being detaches from its mechanical body to an even smaller form with centipede-like legs and that giant eye. While it's never explained what this being is or what it truly looks like, the singular eye allows it to cross over the threshold into body horror, connecting what we thought was completely mechanical into a being a little more like ourselves. Between the giant eye, distorted vocalization, insect-like legs, and spinal quills, along with the blood draining, this creature checks off the majority of what makes body horror so disturbing and truly frightening. Outside the specifics of cybernetics and cloning, there are so many other great examples of body horror in Star Wars as well, some even by choice. Return of the Jedi gave us our first look at the Bomar monks, or what was left of them. These monks believed in isolating themselves from all physical sensation to enhance the power of their minds, and once enlightened, had their brains transplanted into nutrient-filled jars attached to spider-like droid walkers. These walkers could be seen traveling around Jabba's palace and remain there through the events of the Book of Boba Fett series. While the droid's spider-like movement is unsettling enough on its own, the brain jars take the Bomar monks to a whole new level of body horror. And speaking of spiders, we can't talk about body horror without talking about Spider Maul. The Clone Wars Season 4 episode Brothers reintroduced fans to Maul, but nowhere close to how we remembered him. Following his defeat on Naboo at the hands of Obi-Wan Kenobi, Maul's dissected body was dumped on the junkyard world Lotho Minor, where he lived in isolation for 12 years until his rediscovery in 20 BBY. At some point during his exile, Maul utilized discarded metal to create a six-limbed apparatus that allowed him to walk again, coining the out-of-universe nickname Spider Maul due to its resemblance to a spider. Maul's appearance in this episode is so shocking that even Savage Opress mistakes him for a ravenous creature that murdered his brother, and it's not until the Clone Wars Season 5 halfway point that Maul finally gets a new pair of legs that veer away from the body horror of his prior sets. So at this point in Star Wars media, body horror is so baked into the pulp and fantasy of the universe that we don't even recognize it as horror at first glance. But what makes Star Wars body horror so scary is that so much of it is done without the victim's consent. The idea of being turned into a cybernetic being against my will, losing any to every degree of my autonomy and humanity, is way more terrifying than anything else. I'd much rather be force choked to death than live out my days trapped in a mechanical prison or in a shell of my former self, void of any identity or the characteristics that make me, me. So between cyborg Sith Lords, mutated clones, and other unnatural beings, what's your favorite example of body horror in Star Wars? Thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to follow me on social media at ScottyHolidaySW, and as always, may the Force be with you, and happy spooky season.